Good day, everyone, and welcome to our lesson 1 on disaster and disaster risk. Now, PE3 is about first aid and water survival, water safety with disaster and disaster risk reduction and management. Now, in order for us to understand better um, what disaster is and disaster risk and vulnerability is, then we have first to understand the basic concepts of what disaster and disaster risk are. So our objective here is to explain the concept disaster, disaster risk, and vulnerabilities, to determine the elements vulnerable to disasters, identify the capacities to reduce disaster risk and losses. So basically, what is a disaster before going through the hazards? So disaster is the disruption of functioning of a community. Like for example, if a typhoon strikes the city, if it has affected a lot of families, then it can disrupt the functioning of the community. Now, disaster risk is the probability of harmful consequences brought about by the disaster. So these are the chances of having uh, potential damages to certain location. Now, hazards are phenomenon that pose threats to people. So, hazards contribute to the disaster because they are there to as a threat to people, structure, or economic assets that may cause disaster, either man-made or naturally occurring. So, the hazards could be naturally occurring, which is brought about by nature, and it could be man-made, made by man's behavior. Now, the Philippines, with its location um, in the Pacific Ring of Fire, puts it to vulnerability to different types of hazards. Actually, we have almost all of the hazards identified. Now, there are the tropical cyclone, the earthquake, volcanic eruption, the flood, the landslide, and the tsunami. We have drought, bushfire, environmental degradation, civil conflict, population displacement, epidemic, which could be biological, like the one we have right now that causes pandemic, which is the COVID-19, and the technological hazards. Now, in order for us to assess the hazard is to know the location, the scale and magnitude, the impact, the timing and duration, and how does the community responded to that particular hazard, which you are going to do in your activity number 2. So there are killer factors that are related to the hazards. One is rainfall, the rainfall that cause floods. So then the extreme wind brought about by typhoon. Then you have the storm surge and the rain-induced landslide. So landslide happens because of the non-stop rainfall. So the physical characteristics of hazard occurrence. So you have there identify knowledge of hazard, and in order for you to develop particular behavior to address the hazard. The nature or type of forces associated with the hazard, and intensity, capacity, or the potential destructive forces and effects. So vulnerability, as what we have mentioned earlier, is the extent to which a community structure, service, or geographic area is likely to be damaged or disrupted by the impact of a particular hazard. So, on account of its nature, construction, or proximity to hazardous terrain, or on a disaster-prone area. So, we have here, disaster risk puts us, if there is the hazard times the vulnerability of the area, over the capacity, then would result to disaster risk. Why? Because you have now the hazard, then your exposure to it, your threat, and how much capacity are you going to fight, or what resources do you have? Either it could be um, personnel, it could be skills, it could be materials available at hand to fight against any disaster. So let's put it this way. We have here an ape man. So uh, looking at what hazard and vulnerability is. So in this picture, you can see that a man is standing on the ground. So above him is a boulder of rock. Now the boulder of rock is a hazard itself to the man. So where he was standing puts him vulnerable to the hazard that is posing a threat to him. Now, because he doesn't take any action, what happens next? So when that boulder of rock rolled down and fell on the ground, hitting the man, it becomes now the disaster. Why? Because it disrupts now the community's functioning. For example, even if it only hits the man, but for example, there is a road there, the rock is blocking the road, then it can disrupt already the transportation of the locality. Plus the fact that it has caused the life of the person. So if that man could have acted uh, on that hazard prior to prior to the accident or incident that happened, then there will be no more disaster. So that should be the mindset of a person. We should take proactive role in preventing the effect of hazard to our community. Now, the scope of the community, what can the community do to that particular hazard? For example, in that boulder of rock, then they could have requested the Department of uh, Highways or uh, the city government to have that removed with the use of their equipments to avoid that a certain disaster that has happened. So sectoral extent, the range of impact, how much sector of the government is paralyzed by the impact of a disaster. In that case, that's the in that case is the um how what particular sector is being affected, like the transportation, the the economic of the community. Those are the range of impact. Now, can we predict it? Yes, we can, because knowing that the presence of that particular boulder in that mountain or in that highland, we can predict already that there is that tendency to roll down. So some of the hazards can be predicted, like you have the typhoon before it's coming. News centers would report to us when are they gonna arrive, and how can we manage? So by preparing ourselves, by preparing the community, evacuation centers, resources that are there in the community, putting them together so that it can somehow lessen the impact of that particular hazard that is coming. So how frequent are we exposed to that particular hazard? Like in the